He didn't resurrect his wife. He rebuilt her from the body of a teenage boy. Picture this. You're walking through the marble streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD, the scent of incense clinging to the summer heat when you spot the emperor himself. Nero parading across the Roman Forum hand in hand with a woman so strikingly beautiful, she seems sculpted by the gods. Draped in silks from the east, jewels dripping from her neck like melted stars, she walks like a queen. But the whispers follow them like shadows, because everyone who dares to look closer knows the horror hidden behind the elegance. That woman was once a boy. And what you're about to hear is not mythology. It is one of the darkest chapters in Roman imperial history, a true story of obsession, identity, erasure, and the terrifying things that happen when absolute power meets emotional madness. This is not just another tale of ancient Rome's cruelty. This is a story about how grief can rot into delusion, how love can mutate into possession, and how a living person can be transformed into a breathing replica of the dead. His name was Sporus, and his life became a stage, his body a performance for an emperor determined to resurrect the woman he destroyed with his own hands. This is the side of ancient history they don't teach in classrooms. This is dark history uncovered. If you're here because you're drawn to the forbidden truths of the past, hit that like button, subscribe for more disturbing real stories, and comment below where in the world you're watching from, because together, we're about to peel back the curtain on a chapter so grotesque, so intimate, and so painfully human it may change how you see power, love, and identity forever. Nero wasn't born a monster, at least not at first. When he took the imperial throne at the age of 16, the Roman Empire breathed a rare sigh of relief. The people believed they were witnessing the beginning of a golden era. Taxes lowered, public performances funded, games and theater revived under a young ruler who seemed to care about more than war and conquest. But absolute power is a toxin. It doesn't kill quickly, it corrodes slowly, rotting the mind from within, especially when that power is never questioned. Surrounded by sycophants, shielded from criticism, Nero began to live in a reality of his own making, and somewhere between flattery and fear, the emperor started losing his grip. Maybe it was the paranoia of knowing every man around him secretly wanted his throne. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only voice that ever mattered in a population of 60 million. Or maybe it was what happened with the only person he claimed to love. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. She was everything Nero thought he needed, dazzling, sharp, politically cunning, and unafraid of his moods. She wasn't just his mistress. She was his mirror reflecting the grandeur he believed he deserved. But what began as an affair quickly became a dangerous obsession. Nero didn't just desire Poppaea, he needed to own her. He watched her every move, installed guards to monitor her, and bankrupted the treasury to bury her in jewels, perfumes, and silks. When he divorced his first wife Octavia and married Poppaea in a ceremony drenched in imperial decadence, many believed the emperor had finally found his equal. But obsession does not know equilibrium. It consumes, suffocates, and ultimately destroys. Even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero's hunger for control. He isolated Poppaea from her allies, filled her surroundings with loyalists, and surrounded himself with her image in portraits and sculptures. And when she began to push back, when she dared to argue, dared to critique his performances, dared to be more than a fantasy, Nero didn't respond like a husband. He responded like a god betrayed. The argument that ended her life wasn't just a domestic dispute. It was the moment love turned lethal. And from that moment forward, Nero would stop trying to possess Poppaea and start trying to resurrect her. The details of Poppaea Sabina's death are blurred by time and conflicting ancient sources, but the one thing they all agree on is this: it wasn't illness, accident, or fate that took her life. It was Nero. The emperor who once paraded her through the empire like a living trophy ended up destroying her in a moment of raw, unfiltered rage. Some say she criticized him for returning late from the chariot races. Others claim she mocked his artistic performances, a sacred subject to a man who thought of himself as a divine performer. But the reason no longer matters, only the result does. Poppaea was pregnant with their second child when the argument began, and within moments she was on the marble floor, bleeding and broken. Some historians say it was one swift kick to the abdomen. Others describe a sustained beating, his fury exploding against the woman he claimed to worship. But all versions end the same way, with Poppaea dying slowly, the unborn heir lost with her, while Nero collapsed beside her body, whispering apologies far too late. The man who commanded 30 legions, who ruled the known world, who forced cities to chant his name as a god, could not undo the violence of his own hands. And that realization shattered him. In the hours and days that followed, Nero's grief transformed into something monstrous. He refused to burn her body, defying Roman custom, instead ordering an elaborate embalming process and constructing a tomb more luxurious than that of any past empress. He declared her divine, demanded the imperial court speak of her in the present tense, and even arranged daily rituals in her honor. But the most disturbing part wasn't the cult, the tomb, or the denial. It was what came next. Nero began talking to her corpse. He would sit for hours beside her embalmed body, speaking as if she were merely sleeping, as if his words could pull her back from death by sheer imperial will. And in those hours of delusion, a new obsession was born, not with the woman Poppaea had been, but with the illusion of her. Nero didn't want healing. He wanted replacement. In his mind, Poppaea was not truly gone. She was simply waiting to return. All he needed was a vessel, a body, a boy. And that's when Nero's eyes fell upon Sporus. Sporus was likely no more than 14 or 15 when Nero first laid eyes on him, a boy born into the shadowed corridors of the imperial household, raised among stone pillars and whispers, trained for a life of quiet service. He was a freed slave, still bound by the invisible chains of gratitude, dependence, and vulnerability. But what caught Nero's attention wasn't Sporus's loyalty, intellect, or ability. It was his face. According to multiple ancient sources, Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Empress Poppaea, particularly in the eyes, the softness of the cheekbones, the angle of his jaw. In a world where physical likeness was seen as spiritual continuity, the resemblance felt like a message from the gods. For Nero, it was a sign, a second chance, a door to reverse the irreversible. But this wasn't resurrection. This was reconstruction. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing acts of identity erasure in recorded history. Nero did not simply dress Sporus in women's clothing. That would have been theater. This was something far worse. He summoned Rome's best physicians not to heal but to mutilate. His command was clear: transform the boy into a woman. This was no metaphor. It was surgical. Sporus was castrated by force in the imperial palace, the operation performed with primitive tools, crude sedatives, and no guarantee of survival. He would have been held down, silenced, and cut, his body altered permanently for the sake of an emperor's delusion. He would never father children, never grow into manhood, never exist outside of the role imposed upon him. It wasn't just his biology that was taken, it was his future. And Nero didn't stop there. He gave Sporus a new name, Sabina, the same name as the woman he had killed. The same name whispered through the palace like a ghost refusing to leave. The boy had not only lost his body, he had lost his name, his past, and any claim to a self. Nero moved him into private quarters, began commissioning dresses tailored to his newly altered form, hired tutors to train him in the walk, voice, and mannerisms of Roman nobility. And each day, under layers of cosmetics, jewelry, and expectation, the boy once known as Sporus disappeared a little more. This wasn't love. This wasn't grief. This was transformation, as domination, an emperor rebuilding the past, not through memory, but through flesh. The wedding was not a rumor. It was not metaphor. It was a full imperial ceremony, sanctioned by the state, funded by the treasury, and staged like a performance for gods and monsters alike. Nero, having already given Sporus the name Sabina, now announced to the Roman elite that he would make her his wife, not in secret, not in shame, but under the full spotlight of the empire. Invitations were sent. Preparations took months. The palace was transformed into a theater of delusion. seamstresses labored to craft an entire wardrobe that flattered Sporus's surgically altered form, concealing what couldn't be changed and highlighting what had been forcibly taken. Jewels once worn by the real Poppaea were repurposed and hung on the boy's neck and wrists like ornamental chains. Hairdressers curled and lacquered his hair into aristocratic patterns, using heated bronze tools, aromatic oils, and the same care once reserved for an empress. But this wasn't devotion. This was obsession on full display. Sporus was tutored like a doll on how to speak softly, how to hold a gaze, how to smile without revealing the despair behind his eyes. Every gesture, every glance, every step down the marble halls had to replicate a woman who was no longer alive. And when the day came, Rome watched. The hall was flooded with light from thousands of oil lamps. Petals were scattered along the aisles. Music rang out, and Nero appeared beaming with theatrical joy, leading Sporus, now Sabina, down the aisle like a resurrected vision. To the unknowing, it might have looked like a royal union. But to those within the court who knew the truth, it was nothing short of a waking nightmare. A teenage boy, mutilated and masked, being wed to the man who had murdered the woman he was now forced to imitate. The ceremony followed every Roman tradition: the joining of hands, the exchange of vows, the symbolic breaking of bread. It was official, it was legal, and it was horrifying. The audience played their part well, clapping, smiling, offering gifts, but beneath every bow was a chill that could not be hidden. The most powerful man in the world had married a ghost in a borrowed body, and no one dared speak of the grotesque theater unraveling before their eyes. From the moment the vows were spoken, Sporus no longer existed, not as a boy, not as a person, not as himself. He became a curated illusion, a living relic of a woman who was already dead. Nero didn't merely expect a performance, he demanded a full resurrection. And so each day within the walls of the imperial palace, Sporus played a role so elaborate, so emotionally annihilating, it defied understanding. He was assigned a household staff, given quarters draped in silk and shadows, surrounded by attendants who addressed him as Lady Sabina. He traveled by litter flanked by guards, his presence announced at events as though he were truly the Empress reborn. But all of it, every gesture, every moment of artificial pageantry was laced with silent agony. Because this was not luxury. This was captivity dressed in gold. Sporus was expected to appear beside Nero at public functions, to smile on command, to echo sentiments as though he shared memories that were never his. Nero spoke to him not as a husband, but as a man speaking through time, reminiscing about moments that had belonged to Poppaea, now repurposed as shared history with Sabina. Sporus had to pretend to remember them. He had to laugh at jokes never told to him. He had to respond to grief that wasn't his to carry, and through it all he was constantly watched, every expression monitored, every reaction measured. He had to be perfect or risk unraveling the emperor's fragile fiction. Ancient sources say he became eerily skilled at it, mirroring Nero's moods, anticipating his needs, surviving by becoming whatever the emperor needed him to be in any given moment. But behind the grace, something inside him was dying, because every morning he awoke in rooms decorated with tributes to a woman he had never met. Every mirror reflected a version of himself that no longer belonged to him. His name was gone. His body was not his own. His memories were overwritten. Sporus was no longer performing, he was dissolving. This was not love. This was a slow erasure of personhood under the weight of imperial madness. And the most haunting part, the audience applauded. As if the grotesque ceremony in Rome were not enough, Nero's obsession soon escalated into something even more surreal, a traveling exhibition of his fantasy. When the emperor prepared for a grand tour of Greece in 67 AD, a voyage meant to satisfy his hunger for praise and artistic validation, he did not leave his ghost bride behind. Sporus, now Sabina in name and appearance, was taken along not as a companion, but as a living artifact, a curated echo of a woman long dead. Nero fancied himself not only a ruler but a performer, a poet, a demigod in flesh, and this tour became a theater of delusion on a scale the ancient world had never seen. He entered competitions, recited poetry, sang before judges who had no choice but to declare him victorious. And always beside him was Sporus, dressed in imperial finery, smiling on command, seated in splendor, yet buried in silence. To Greek dignitaries and foreign crowds unfamiliar with the tragedy behind the mask, it may have looked like a traditional royal couple. But the Roman officials and attendants who knew the truth were forced to witness a horrifying charade unfold city after city. Sporus was paraded before temples, banquets, and games as the Empress of Rome, a role he never asked for, built on a body not his own, scripted with memories that belonged to the dead. The performances did not stop on stage. Every interaction was a scene, every dinner a pageant, every whispered command from Nero a reminder that Sporus's survival depended on his ability to remain a convincing illusion. This wasn't travel, it was psychological warfare across provinces. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that the very man who destroyed Poppaea now used Sporus as a living monument to her, forcing the boy to relive a life that was never his. Through words he never spoke, with eyes that no longer recognized the reflection in the mirror. Each step across foreign soil was a performance in the grandest tragedy of all, the performance of someone else's resurrection at the cost of your own soul. And the farther they went from Rome, the deeper Sporus was buried beneath silk's powder and the expectations of a mad god. By the spring of 68 AD, the illusion was cracking, and Nero's empire, built on spectacle, fear, and delusion, was unraveling faster than even he could perform his way through. While he toured Greece, basking in praise, he demanded chaos had ignited behind him. Governors, tired of his neglect and theatrical vanity, raised their own banners. Legions turned against him. The Senate, once his stage, declared him a public enemy. Even the Praetorian Guard, once loyal to the throne, abandoned him. The same man who had ruled like a deity now fled like a criminal. And in the middle of this downfall, still costumed in the performance of imperial grandeur, was Sporus. He didn't flee as a freedman or a courtier. He fled as a symbol, as a reflection of a fantasy that had now become a liability. Nero, even in his final hours, refused to let go of the illusion. He took Sporus with him, as he escaped through the outskirts of Rome, hiding in a villa surrounded by the last few who hadn't yet betrayed him. Desperate, frantic Nero paced between grandiose escape plans and rehearsals for a noble suicide. He wept. He raged. He clung to what was never real. And all the while Sporus watched. The boy who had been renamed, reshaped, and rewritten now stood as the only living witness to the final act of the man who had consumed his life. When the end came, it wasn't glorious. It was chaos. With enemies closing in and execution inevitable, Nero took his own life, stabbing his throat with a blade he couldn't even hold steady without assistance. And just like that, the performance ended. The curtains fell, but not for Sporus. For him, Nero's death did not mean freedom, it meant exposure. Because now, stripped of protection, he was no longer an imperial wife or a walking ghost. He was a political artifact, a grotesque souvenir of a reign that Rome wanted to forget. And yet he couldn't just vanish. Too many had seen, too many knew. Sporus, the living echo of Poppaea, had become the most dangerous kind of survivor, one who remembered everything. And in the ruins of Nero's empire, his body was still dressed in silk, but his soul was a battlefield. What happens to a puppet when the puppeteer dies? It doesn't rest. It lingers, and sometimes it's passed to the next hand. After Nero's suicide, the empire descended into chaos, a vacuum of power sucking Rome into a maelstrom of betrayal, bloodshed, and short-lived emperors. But for Sporus, the fall of Nero did not mean escape. It meant transference. He was no longer the emperor's bride, but he was still property. A symbol. A fragile thread connecting the world to a reign they desperately wanted to erase, yet couldn't stop staring at. In the brutal year that followed, the year of the 4 emperors, Sporus was passed like a cursed relic between men who knew exactly what he had been forced to become. First came Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian Guard commander who attempted to seize power. He took Sporus into his care not out of compassion, but out of ambition. To possess Sporus was to inherit the pageantry of Nero's court, to wrap himself in the leftovers of imperial mystique. And so the performance continued. Sporus was still expected to wear the silks, speak with softness, walk as Sabina. The role had become his skin. When Sabinus was murdered, Sporus was claimed by Otho, another contender for the throne, and former lover of Poppaea. For Otho, having Sporus beside him was almost poetic, a way to reclaim what Nero had stolen, both power and Poppaea. But no one ever asked Sporus what he wanted, because by now no one remembered that he had ever been anyone at all. He was a character in their fantasies, a haunting souvenir from a darker time. When Vitellius seized control next, the descent deepened. He planned something worse than imitation. He wanted Sporus thrown into the arena not as a combatant but as a spectacle. A reenactment of the myth of Proserpina, the goddess of spring dragged into the underworld. A public humiliation, a punishment turned performance. And that finally was the line Sporus would not cross. After years of obedience, of survival through silence, he made one final choice his own. Faced with the threat of being raped, degraded, and laughed at before thousands, Sporus took his life, likely through poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was no more than 20 years old. But in that act, he did something no emperor had ever allowed him to do. He became himself again, not in life, but in resistance. His death was not a tragedy, it was a rebellion. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim your name is to choose how it ends. The tragedy of Sporus doesn't end with his death. It deepens in the silence that followed. Because history, so often written by the victors and shaped by the powerful, barely speaks his name. His story was preserved only in fragments, footnotes, in ancient accounts, obsessed more with the madness of Nero than with the humanity of the boy caught in his shadow. Sporus, the teenager who had his body mutilated, his identity stripped, and his soul bent into a role he never chose, was remembered not as a person but as a symbol of imperial perversion. Ancient historians wrote of him like a curiosity, a macabre anecdote in a larger tale of Rome's decadence. They didn't ask what he felt, what he feared, or what he dreamed. They didn't care who he had been before the palace, before the silks, before the mirrors started lying. That's what makes his story so devastating, not just the physical and psychological abuse, but the absolute erasure of his existence. In choosing to die on his own terms, Sporus tried to reclaim something the world had denied him, the right to be seen, not as an object or an empress or a spectacle, but as a human being. And yet, after death, even that was taken from him. There are no monuments to Sporus, no marble busts in Roman museums. His grave is unknown, his real name lost. We don't know if he ever laughed freely, if he had friends, if he dreamed of anything beyond survival. We only know what he was forced to become, and how that performance ultimately killed him. But maybe remembering his story now, in a time when voices from the past can be revived, is its own act of resistance. Maybe speaking his name, Sporus, is a way of rewriting the ending. Because history isn't just about emperors and battles and conquests. It's about the people caught in the gears of power, the ones history tried to forget. And when we remember them not as symbols, but as souls, we break the silence they were buried in. Sporus was never just Nero's doll. He was a boy, a person, a survivor. And his story deserves more than the footnote history gave him. It deserves to be told again and again until it can't be erased. Maybe the real horror of this story isn't just what Nero did, it's how familiar it feels. Because deep down we recognize it. The manipulation, the silencing, the way power twists love into control and identity into performance. We've all felt it in some way, being made to play a role, just to be accepted, to shrink ourselves into something more palatable, more convenient, more useful to someone else. Sporus's story is extreme, yes, but that's what makes it unforgettable. It holds a mirror to the darkest impulses of humanity, the desire to dominate, reshape, and possess. And that mirror doesn't just reflect Nero, it reflects anyone who has ever tried to own what should only be loved freely. If this story left you unsettled, if something about it clung to your chest like a weight that's not a coincidence, that's the echo of a truth too often buried. Sporus was stripped of everything: his name, his body, his future, but in remembering him we give something back. We remind the world that he mattered, that every erased voice deserves a second telling. If this video sparked something in you, anger, sadness, a deeper curiosity, don't let it fade. Comment below what struck you the most. What part of this story should the world never forget? Save this video if you ever want to return to the truth behind the empire's gold and marble. And if you believe more people need to hear the human cost behind history's grandest names, subscribe now, because we're just getting started. This channel is where the forgotten are finally remembered, where the myths fall away, and where history gets personal. One voice at a time, one truth at a time. Sporus never got to speak, but we can speak for him. And maybe in doing so, we'll find the courage to stop playing roles we never chose. Because the most radical act in a world that wants to reshape you is simply to be yourself. Unapologetically, relentlessly, finally.